Hello and welcome all back to Election Time News Canada. Today is Wednesday, September 17th, 2025, and today we're going to be looking into the opinion polling of the current Liberal government. Here we have the results map with margins adjusted for the 2025 election results. And so we're going to be potentially shifting that a bit, see how things might go based on the opinion polling right now, which we'll get to in a moment. Election Time News, your one stop for all things elections and politics, from summations to poll reviews and news. Subscribe below for more content like this about American, Canadian, and Australian elections. Also, make sure to follow the Substack, Threads, Instagram, and X to stay up to date on political news and happenings in all three countries. Remember, there's never a dull moment in politics. So, we have here is the final result map for the 2025 election. And so what we saw was a large liberal overperformance. And so we ended up with a barely minority government, plurality government for the Liberals. They ended up with 160 seats. That was they had 160 seats. They ended up winning 169. That was a net 17 seat gain. They did end up losing quite a few over time. As you can see, they had 160 there, but over time they did lose quite a few. They got a lot back. They ended up gaining 17 seats. They did 11 points better in the popular vote. They actually won it, even though last time in 2021 they did lose it back when Justin Trudeau was leading the ticket. They actually lost the popular vote, but they still won a relatively large plurality. This is mostly due to how the districts were drawn and also just the percentages by which the Liberals won their districts versus the margins the Conservatives won theirs by. Generally speaking, in a lot of these ones, the Conservatives would be winning by closer to by almost 70%, where the Liberals in some of these deeper urban regions will only be winning by 30%, and that does add up. So that would be the main issue with that, but they did end up actually winning the popular vote this time around, and so it was actually somewhat of an unexpected performance, and so that was the main thing there. If you look at the opinion polls, this was the general voting intentions, but this was only from March. If we look going back way further, then you start from the final election where you had the Conservatives narrowly winning. The Conservatives actually dipped right after that, because there was some popularity with the Liberal government continuing out, but then the Conservatives started gaining over time as we got into 2023. And then once we got to mid 2023, when Conservatives started to spike, the Liberals collapsed completely, and the gap at one point, right at the beginning of 2024, was about 20 points, and we would have seen a huge blue wave across the entire country, and the Conservatives would have done very, very well. But then, right around the same time, two things happened. One, Donald Trump got elected in the United States as president, and with a lot of promises or statements about potentially trying to integrate Canada as a state or as multiple states into the United States. There was a difference of opinion on both sides. Conservatives seem to be a bit more tame on the topic, and the Liberals were actually a bit more hawkish. And then, but the most likely the more substantive thing is that Justin Trudeau stepped down as the leader of the Liberal Party, and Mark Carney took that spot, and immediately the opinion of the Liberal Party started to come back, and so it had a skyrocket. And by the time 4 months later that the election took place, and was actually 3 short months later, the Liberals actually ended up with a relatively impressive victory. And so, what was originally expected to be a blue storm with tons of seats all throughout in these outer suburban regions and all across the country in these smaller cities and even outer regions over here that are somewhat more rural, less inhabited areas, would have probably have ended up being very blue. Instead, the Liberals ended up coalescing support from the from the NDP, which collapsed right at the same time, and also got back some from the Conservatives to be able to pull out a relatively strong win there. But this was also in a sort of an election that ended up turning towards a two-party system, as this was actually the first time in decades that both the Liberal and Conservative parties got over 40% of the popular vote. So that is a relatively large thing of note. The both of them actually ended up gaining seats, and so, but the bloc lost quite a few seats. The NDP lost partisan status after losing 17 seats. The Greens actually lost one of their two seats, and all three of those did end up losing in the popular vote. The NDP did lose quite a lot in the popular vote, and also three of the five of these leaders, one of them being this was, I believe, May, I believe was the one who did no Saanich. So it was actually Pednault did lose that race in Tremont, but Saanich, Clough Islands is Elizabeth May, and she is the only member of the Green Party currently in the parliament. So, but then we also have Blanchet did end up winning re-election, but Poilievre actually lost in an upset in Carleton, but he has been since reinstated in a special election after one of the members did end up dropping out from somewhere in Alberta. I don't exactly remember where. Battle River Crowfoot, right here, actually. So this is the. That was actually pretty convenient that I found it there. Battle River Crowfoot, there was a special election recently that Poilievre did end up winning by about 65%, just 1 or 2 points worse than the margin that took place in April, and that's to be expected because he didn't have the incumbency status. So, with all of that, now let's look over at the opinion polling. So now we have they're in terms currently, but they are absolutely in at the hands of the opinion polling because they're definitely going to want to go for re-election again. While this is I believe the third cycle in a row now that they have had, make that actually fourth in a row that they have been the plurality government, where last time that happened was 2011, and then in 2015 they won in a landslide from 2011. In 2011 they only had 34 seats. And that was back actually when the NDP was actually at its strongest, 103. This is the map. A lot of strength in there. Very little for the Liberals, mostly on the East Coast. And then in 2015, the Liberals took a lot of seats, and they actually gained 148 at the expense of both the NDP and the Conservatives. They lost 20. The NDP started to fall apart. The Bloc did gain some notoriety there at that point in time. And then going into 2021, the Bloc didn't really gain anything. Nobody really gained any seats from 2019 to 2021. Instead, there were 5 given to the Liberals and 1 to the NDP, but other than that, it was essentially unchanged. And then in 2025, of course, there were gains for the two main elections at the expense of everyone else. But at this point, then we do still have the number one thing being the 46th federal election. And so the question is going to be how long, what are we going to be looking at here? Is going to be the Liberals are definitely going to want to be probably try to improve on that, be able to get a majority government, but they narrowly have a minority government, 172 seats needed for the majority, and they have 169. A gain of 3 seats wouldn't be too difficult, as there were 11 seats that were under 2 percentage points. Even just over here, if they flipped Cloverdale and Pitt Meadows, then they would get to 171, and then just one more that's a tilt margin would be able to get them over that 170 line. There's one here in Vancouver. That's still Cloverdale. It's the exact same one right over here in Hamilton, Cambridge. Potentially get that. You could get Windsor. Here are 3 right here: Kitchener, Kitchener South, and Cambridge. Those 3 right there would be enough for the Liberals to be able to secure a majority government, which would then make things a bit easier. They wouldn't have to actually have any cooperation with the Greens or the NDP, which generally are the voting blocks here. They generally are all seen to be a bit liberal. The conservatives are obviously a bit conservative, and the bloc is somewhat moderate. They tend to be a bit more just pro Quebec in general. So the main idea is going to be how well are they going to be able to perform in the polls, and so we're looking at is a general relative consistency. The Conservatives have started to gain a little bit of ground. They did have a bit of a bowl that bottomed out in mid-July, but now they've kind of come back up to the exact same numbers. They actually are quite a bit below and have considerably been below where their vote share was in the 2025 election. That's right about where the Liberals are polling. The Liberals are a little bit below as well. The NDP has lost potentially a little bit here, but not necessarily that poor of a performance. The Bloc is staying relatively consistent. The People's Party is actually polling better than they performed, and the same thing for the Greens. So a little bit of movement back towards these other nominal parties. And as of right now, there's essentially nothing unchanged. If anything, these 8 seats and those 11 seats might be a bit competitive again. These would be the ones that you would be looking out for potential losses for the NDP as well, even though they actually already did relatively poorly, considering everything in the most recent election, but the largest one in the entire country being Nunavut is also going to be competitive in that case as well. But if you look all across the country, there are a few that are somewhat competitive. And so those are going to be the ones that we're still going to be looking at most likely next time around. Most of them are actually will end up being competitive. It depends entirely on how things continue to trend. But all right, that was not the right one. Some of these shades are close enough that I can't necessarily tell 100% of the time which ones are which. So get all of these very competitive ones that were under 2 percentage points are going to be off of the map here. And so that's going to be the main thing to look out for. So we end up essentially with, there's still 3 left. They're probably going to be relatively small ones, probably in these urban centers, or maybe I'm just overlooking them completely. But the main idea is that these are going to be the ones that we're going to be watching out for the entire few years, especially as these were all decided by less than 2 percentage points. And with it being that close, obviously all of these are going to end up being very contested, not only for, next cycle, but they're going to be essentially prioritized at this point. It depends entirely on the national mood and how the government continues to do. That's the wrong tab. If we look then at how the NDP is continuing to do, they're actually overperforming their expectations as well. If the NDP wants to be able to make gains back in some of these areas that they lost, there were a few that were relatively competitive. We actually reload this map real quick and then end up. And this is a few that was way too close, none of it, but a few of them were relatively close that they actually lost from the Liberals actually gained it from the NDP in some of these outer areas in the city. Some of them not really, but some of them were somewhat competitive. Kitchener was actually flips from the Liberals. This was actually a loss from the Greens for Kitchener Center. In May, but you do have a few flips away from the NDP. I'm forgetting exactly where they were, but there were a few across the country that were lost either both to the Liberals and to this was one from the Conservatives. Windsor West was an orange district for a good while, but that did flip to the Conservatives because of that split ticket voting there to there's a few in the inner city areas. There's Piedmont, but the main because some of these were actually orange not all that long ago. There's a few losses by the Conservatives in some of these inner city regions. This is mostly just the Liberals officially taking their claims, if you will, to the inner urban regions, but you also get some of these Quebecian suburbs that also shifted to the Liberals away from the bloc. You still see that's mostly where they are at, and some of these rural regions, but some of these other ones, that was a flip from the bloc. And so that's going to be a large rural region while some of these other ones stayed with the bloc. So again, it's going to completely depend on the mood. And so we're going to keep having to keep an eye on those polls there based on the third party potentially overperforming there. Now, what we're going to be looking at is the regional polls is going to be especially interesting because, for example, in the beginning of the night in the election, we were seeing potential strong overperformances for the Liberals. They were doing relatively okay in, I believe that's Newfoundland, but yes, Newfoundland. But over in the islands over here, it wasn't necessarily it was very, very impressive over performances. But then once you got to the west, once you got to Alberta, Saskatchewan, you weren't necessarily seeing close to as strong over performances as you had been not all that long ago. And once you got to British Columbia, they actually did a bit poorer than expected. Pitt Meadows, Langley, Cloverdale, Abbotsford all did a bit worse than expected. Also in Richmond Center, that was another one that was potentially expected to flip. So, and all of those, that's the main reason that they actually ended up missing out on the majority, was they were expected to potentially have a majority government, and most were projecting that it was, but then they ended up losing these all by under 10 points. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 just in the outer Vancouver region, and that's going to be the main focus, obviously, probably going into next cycle for a main prioritization of being able to gather that together. But if we look at Alberta and Western Canada, the Conservatives are definitely up, but not by close to as much. Only a 19-point lead. So that's going to be very interesting to see. 3% margin of error, but that's honestly a lot of undecideds because that's lower and that's way lower. That's a 9-point loss there. And that's actually a lot higher. The Labor Party or Liberal Party is actually overperforming by 7 points. Meanwhile, the Conservatives are down by 9. So if this is anything close to accurate for Alberta and anything that could potentially happen, then that would essentially mean that the Liberals would be able to come in here and most likely pick off Edmonton, and they'd be able to potentially flip Calgary and Calgary Center. And that right there would be enough. That'd be 3. That would be enough to take control of the chamber. So even just based on the polls in and of itself would be enough to flip control. And so the general idea now, the others is going to be the main thing there, but also along with the fact that there's a few undecideds here, that's going to be 89. No, actually, not a lot of them. They're mostly coalesced in the late Liberal Party. That's going to be the main thing. But moving on, next is going to be the leadership polls. Who should be the best? Who's the best prime minister? Considering the fact that it started out in the very beginning of the cycle, or right after the prime ministership took over at 7.6 for Nanos Research. Nanos Research is the one that's really been doing this, so that means that you can generally trust this trend line for more or less, more so than a few other ones. This was right after the end of the cycle. That was essentially that was before it actually happened. 6.2 for Carney. Now we're at the point where it's at 20 up to 28. 28 is the highest. That was about a month and a half ago now. But even recently, it's been 22 for Carney against the number 2 being Polyev. And so he's over 50% and has been consistently in the Nanos Research since the end of July, and even then, that was essentially a one-off poll. If you continue going back and only Nanos Research, then it actually goes all the way back to early June. He's been above 50% since early June, and he's been sitting in the 20s since then. Innovative research has gone from 13 to 11. That's actually a bit of a drop. 13 to 13 to 11, a little bit of a drop there. There's been a little bit of a drop since early August going into September. But the main point is that he's consistently still doing well and he's polling with high approval. The general government approval has been doing relatively well, and very recently it actually did have a spike up with Ipsos having 58% approval. That's a very high approval rating. That's going to be that dot right there. You only had two that were higher. And that's going to be the main trend line up here. Then you end up going with a bit of a drop down going into late June. That's going to be a bit of a down period, but now we end up getting into the net approval. Is going to be actually only plus 16. You have a bit less. You have zero unsures, and some of these you have a bit of unsure. 13%. 11% looks like Lager and Innovative Research have that as an option, but none of the others do. Abacus data is going to be the main tracker on this one, the most recent one being September 2nd, a month ago, plus 18. Starting at the very beginning was plus 26. So actually, this was a bit of a decline. You look at plus 26 going to plus 30 to plus 27, continuing at plus 27, plus 25, 23, 19, 18. So it is starting to drop off a little bit for Abacus data according to their poll sets, but we would need another one coming up in a bit, most likely. That was half a month ago, but it appears that it's happening about every month or so, so we're probably not going to get another one for potentially 3 weeks or so, but generally that's going to be the main thing. If we look at all the polls together, those the general polling average, then there is actually a spike up, and it is actually reaching the highest it has been during the financial structuring period that has just started. So that's going to be the final general polling there. Relatively high approval. We're seeing strong support for Carney as the hopeful leader. He's doing relatively well in Western Canada. In Ontario, he's also actually gained a bit. But this is generally to be expected. In Quebec, basically the exact same numbers that we saw for the election, though. So basically no gains in Quebec and Central Canada. Ontario, there's actually a bit of a gain there. In the Ontario regions over here, probably in the southern region, there's quite a few very close districts. If you look over here, a few ridings, Kitchener, this whole area, again, those three, if he ended up having these numbers in Ontario, 54-37, then the Liberals easily would have won all three, which means that they would end up with a straight-up majority of 172, and that would have been it. But instead, the Conservatives narrowly pulled off all four by under 2 percentage points. But all this is generally good news for the Liberals. They're continuing to do well in government. They are relatively well approved of, including Mark Carney himself. And so they also didn't perform very poorly in the by-election in Battle River Crowfoot. So all this together does show a strong approval for the Liberal government as of right now. We'll have to continue seeing how things go in a bit. Thank you all so much for watching today's video. Let me know of any ideas you have in the comments, any questions you have. Make sure to keep it civil and have a fantastic rest of your day.